Over the past few weeks, we have been deep into building this Dodger. And along the way, I noticed something I did not expect. Throughout this boat build, we've learned a lot about boat building in general, and we've built strong relationships with a few boat builders and composite specialists, which means there's way too much to put into just one video. But now that the major construction of UMA is done, and we've built a lot with plywood and with foam, we've used a ton of vinyl ester and epoxy. We've seen firsthand the differences between each material and the pros and cons of each. And a lot of you guys have been asking in the comment section why we're choosing certain materials over others, which led me down a pretty deep rabbit hole. So this week, I'm gonna take some scraps of foam that we have left over from these build projects, and we're gonna laminate them together with different weights of glass and vinyl ester resin and epoxy resin. And we're going to then experiment with them and see how they compare to this marine ply that we used for all the bulkheads inside. So let's start testing some stuff. All right, so I just finished cutting down all of the samples so that they're all exactly the same dimensions. I decided to cut them into 3 strips each. So we've got like 3 strips of 600 epoxy, we've got 3 strips of 1800 vinyl ester. And that way, when we do get to breaking them, we can add and divide and get an average. So that's not just like one test per. But before we get to breaking anything, we're gonna take all these inside and weigh them, so that we can get an idea about how much glass versus resin versus foam is in each one of these, so we have something to calculate with. There we go.
All right, guys, before we get into the next phase of this experiment, I want to quickly say thank you to BetterHelp for being the paid partner of this week's video. You know, doing projects like this, we spend a lot of time figuring out what works, what doesn't, and why. And sometimes it's so easy to focus on materials and methods out here that we tend to forget to check into what's going on in here. For a long time, I didn't really get therapy. Growing up, we didn't talk much about mental health, and if you were going through something, it had to be serious. So I always thought that the only time you would talk to a professional was if you needed a psychiatrist, like something was really wrong. It never crossed my mind that you could just want to talk to someone before things got that bad. Even after I moved abroad and saw how common therapy was in other places, part of me still felt like it wasn't for me. Like I should be able to handle this on my own, or my problems weren't big enough to need help. But the truth is, it's that kind of thinking that keeps us stuck, because I've learned that asking for help doesn't make you weak. It means that you're ready to grow. Even though there's more awareness now, especially with social media, a lot of people still see therapy as something for people who are broken, and that's just not true. That's why we're partnering with BetterHelp to help break that stigma. Therapy isn't about being broken, it's about learning new tools, talking things through, and getting a fresh perspective from someone who's actually trained to help you. And BetterHelp makes it really easy to get started. After you fill out a short questionnaire, you'll be matched with a credentialed therapist within just a few days. It's all online and all on your schedule. And if the match doesn't feel right, it's really easy and free to switch. So if you're curious or you think this could be good for you, check out the link in the description below, or head over to betterhelp.com/sailinguma to get 10% off your first month. All right, let's get back into this experiment and see how these materials really stack up.
All right, so I spent the morning trying to figure out how to break these in a controlled fashion. And I built a thing. So we've got samples of foam, samples with resin on it, and then 1 layer of glass, 2 layers of glass, 3 layers of glass with vinyl ester, 1, 2, 3 layers of glass with epoxy, and then 12 millimeter marine ply, 20 mil marine ply, and then just for funsies, we cut some strips out of the Dodger top, which is 25 millimeter foam, and it's a little bit different because it's 3 layers of 400 and then 2 layers of 400. So it's not really a fair comparison, but it will give us some numbers to work with. So my little machine that I made goes something like this. We got this like cheap crane scale off Amazon that we were going to use to weigh our mast later. And on it, I put a Dynamo loop and a socket. And so we'll be able to feed the samples through and then like position them up here in between these 2 jack stands. Should be exactly the same width each time. And then I built this because it's a 1 centimeter thick piece of plywood. And so first we're gonna like center it for one. And then we're gonna put force on it until each sample bends down by 1 centimeter. So we'll be able to measure how much force is involved to deflect it by 1 centimeter. And then continue adding force until it breaks. And hopefully we can see the force before it breaks, because this doesn't have like a max load feature. It just sort of shows the number, and it only goes up in half kilo increments. So it's not super accurate, but it should give us a relatively good number to work with. That's the plan. So we're gonna break all these samples, we're gonna record all the data, and then we're gonna see what the numbers look like when we're done. That's the plan. We're gonna start with a 20 mil marine ply because it's gonna have the most like, it's probably one of the more difficult ones to actually get to break. All right, right at 41 kilos, it's deflected to, I can see both of these underneath it, 1 centimeter. So then over here, under marine ply, and under 10 millimeter deflection, and under sample 1, I can write 41 kilos. Let me keep going until it breaks. 50, 60. It's right at like 62 I saw. I wish this had like a hold feature. Otherwise we're gonna have to like instant replay it each time. And then I put a little bungee cord on there so it catches it so it doesn't smash our scale. All right, I saw 62. All right. Test number 2 of 1/2 inch or 20 mil marine ply. Right at 39 kilos to deflect it. $67. It does give it like, it does hold for like a split second as it goes back down. So that one I saw 67. That back at the center. $71.5. So the numbers on each test are definitely not going to be the same because they're not, like they're different, especially with the wood, like there's variations in how I pull or whatever. But that's why I cut each sample into 3. So that's why they're 3 centimeters wide. So that we get like an average between the 3. Because if we just had 1, that's not really a good enough sample size. That's what I'm looking for. I guess I was just starting with the foam. I made some samples that are just foam and some that are just resin, just because, even though obviously these aren't anything structural, but it kind of is gonna illustrate the point between something that's flexible. And then I just smeared some resin on these, which made them very stiff, but also quite brittle. These are gonna break in a much less amount of weight than the rest of them. So we're gonna test these at the end, but I'm interested to see what happens. So I guess we're gonna start straight in on the vinyl ester samples and then the epoxy samples. So this is the first one of vinyl ester. It says 600V, so we've got 1 layer of 600 glass on each side. And let's see how they break. I kind of built this system with that marine ply in mind. So I hope that this gives a a similar result. Oops. I hope that it's not like too strong or anything like that. Put that in the center. And also this whole rig weighs half a kilo. So it's already deflecting a tiny bit. I'll put that in the center. So this is gonna deflect 4.5 kilos. 10, 10 and a half, 11, 12, I hear it cracking, 13, 13. It's pretty anticlimactic. 4, 7, 8, 9, 10, 10 and a half, 11, 12, I hear it crunching, 13, 13 and a half, 14, 14 and a half, 15, 16. Wow, look at it go. It's giving up. Yeah, 15 and a half. Yeah, I got 16 on that one. It's interesting. This one actually like shattered the bottom, whereas the other one buckled in from the top and just sort of bent. So that's kind of interesting. All right, last one of the 600. We're just gonna like run through all of these now and log the data and then see what kind of conclusions we can draw after. All right, well, that was super fun. Until I look at the actual spreadsheet, I don't really remember what all of these broke at, but my initial impressions were somewhat predictable in that I know that vinyl ester is stiffer than epoxy, and that's why these ones actually ended up breaking, because they didn't bend as far, like the 600 vinyl ester. Whereas the 600 epoxy just like bent and bent and bent and bent and bent and never actually broke under our test because it just popped down underneath. We got one of the 1200s to break, and it just has like a little kink in it where the top compressed. And then the resin, just resin, obviously, as almost just a joke, just to show that it's super brittle, but has like no strength whatsoever. As opposed to if we just had the foam, which is actually quite brittle as well, but it's also very flexible, and it keeps going, keeps going, keeps going. And it's actually kind of hard to break, because it just is super flexible. It was interesting to see how each one of them broke. The plywood obviously was kind of expected, but a lot of them just sort of buckled and compressed in the top layer and kind of bent in the foam and didn't actually snap the bottom layer. So it wasn't like a complete failure, but it definitely buckled under load. And that's also because how we were testing it. Very thin strips, very high load in a very thin area, which is kind of impractical, but it also gives us a pretty good, it's very windy. It gives us a very good, baseline to test all these against. So we're gonna clean this up and go inside and look at the numbers and see what they tell us.
All right, we've got results.
We're looking at a spreadsheet, so that's my least favorite thing to do. I brought in three, the 12 mil marine ply, 1200 epoxy and 1200 vinyl ester, because I think those were the most comparable. This is what we used in the boat, was the 12 millimeter marine ply. And then the epoxy and the vinyl ester are almost exactly the same thickness with 2 layers of 600 gram glass on each side. So looking at the numbers, there's a lot here. One thing that I saw that was kind of interesting was that we couldn't break the epoxy, the 2 weaker layers of the epoxy, the 600 and the 12, which was interesting because it sort of goes to show that the vinyl ester is much stiffer, but the epoxy like is kind of inconclusive, because where we could break the epoxy ones were the 1800, so 3 layers of 600 on each side. And those consistently, the epoxy broke with less force than the vinyl ester did. 36.5, which I found very interesting, that the epoxy was actually weaker.
So they were more flexible, but then when they snapped, when they finally broke, it required less load.
Yeah, so that's interesting, because vinyl ester, at least when it's thicker, is stiffer and stronger than the epoxy.
Which
was
is
not
funny.
expecting that.
No, I wasn't expecting it because it's kind of contradictory to everything that people's been telling us.
Now, there's a very deep rabbit hole that we could be going down, which we don't have time or money or resources to go down, which includes like vacuum infusing, vacuum bagging, different types of epoxy, different types of hardeners, different types of glass. Like it's sort of an unlimitedly deep rabbit hole you could go down engineering, the stiffest, lightest, strongest, whatever.
The different viscosity of the vinyl ester.
Different viscosity.
Notice it matters.
That was the other thing we noticed actually, is that the epoxy we were using had a slightly thicker viscosity, and so the weight of the epoxy versus the vinyl ester, like this one was 81 grams on average, and this one was 77. So according to our tests, vinyl ester versus West Systems, vinyl ester is stiffer, stronger, and lighter. So that's not what I was expecting at all. We were also measuring them with this 10 mil foam, which is super thin, but it is most comparable to the 12 mil plywood that we were using. So obviously the difference is when you double the thickness of plywood, you double its weight. Whereas when you double the thickness of this, you're only doubling the foam weight, you're keeping the glass weight. So on average, the marine ply broke with 26 kilos of force on it and broke in half. On average, the vinyl ester 12 was the closest, breaking at 32 kilos, so like slightly stronger. But the vinyl ester with one layer broke at 14, and with two layers broke at 44. And the epoxy broke at 25. So 7 kilos less, and the epoxy broke, which I also thought was quite interesting.
But what I think is also interesting is that, so this one, when it snapped, it just snapped.
Yeah.
Right?
Like splintered. Whereas these just kind of buckled, like they just kind of did that.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously it loses its integrity and structural elements, but it doesn't snap apart.
Yeah.
So I would, just with that, I would choose either epoxy or vinyl ester over this in terms just with that one
of sort of strength.
Yeah.
Like it's not a catastrophic failure, I guess, because it's still sort of waterproof. But also this is another sort of caveat to this test is you're not really ever putting, and like unless you're doing like a floorboard or like something flat, you're not really ever putting like a bulkhead in that amount of force, right? Because it's mostly shear force that you're getting across a bulkhead, unless it's like a bench seat or a floor or something like that. But it was sort of the best way we could test something that we could come up with. And so we could compare all these materials across the board. There's obviously other characteristics to be involved, but this is just like one level of one test that we can do here in the boatyard.
Yeah. What I found also pretty crazy is that the 20 mil ply, we have those as the main bulkheads.
Two of our bulkheads are 20 mil ply.
And they have the strongest strength comparatively to all the other things
these
that we
were,
calculated.
yeah, so the 20 mil marine ply is stronger than anything that we calculated that was composite, except for the 25 mil Dodger piece was actually very similar.
But it's so thick.
So the 20 millimeter marine ply on average broke at 66.8 kilos of force down. And the top of the Dodger broke at 64. So ever so slightly weaker, which was also kind of interesting because that marine ply is just super strong stuff. On average, I would say that most likely if we were going to be building something out of foam core and resin, this somewhere around this 1200 range would be good. Maybe 1000 grams on each side or 1200 grams, because the glass we have access to is either 440 grams per layer or 600 grams per layer. So if it was 440, we'd be putting 3 on. And if it was 600, we'd be putting 2 layers on, right? So on average, this is the most comparable thing, is the 1200 grams per side with vinyl ester or epoxy, right? So here's the other number that I find interesting. If I did the calculations on the iPad, and we have roughly 68 square meters of bulkhead that we installed, right? So if we built them out of 2 layers of 600, so 1200 grams per side, and vinyl ester, it would have cost us just over 3,000 euro to put in all of our bulkheads. And that doesn't include like the tabbing on the side, because that was the same for plywood or vinyl ester.
And the time that it would take for us to
It doesn't include time of actually building these.
Yeah.
So it would cost us just over 3,000 if we built them all out of vinyl ester and
And
glass
this was
and foam core.
easily available
Yeah.
at the store.
Right, and we didn't have to order all this stuff. That doesn't include shipping for all these materials. If we built it out of epoxy, it would have more than doubled it, 6,800 euro to build all of our bulkheads out of glass and epoxy.
But out of West System epoxy.
West System epoxy, which is good stuff, but also pretty expensive. We can get local epoxy a little bit cheaper here, but not much cheaper. We did build our bulkheads out of 12 millimeter plywood, and that cost us 880 euro. So the vinyl ester is almost 3 times more, and the epoxy is like closer to 8 times more.
Wow.
So.
And
that doesn't include labor of actually building this.
That doesn't include shipping it, because we've learned West System, we can't find it here.
Yeah.
The last shipment we had from the United States, we had to pay almost 100% in taxes. Getting
resin on island is very hard because you can't just buy it online and have it shipped. So we can't buy it from like Easy Composites or one of those European distributors. But there's a local dealership that sells West System epoxy, and they can get it in somehow in a truck or whatever. But they charge a lot for shipping and handling and import fees. So that's why one of the main reasons we're not even thinking about using epoxy is just so much more expensive. And as we've seen from this test, it's heavier, more expensive, and weaker, which is insane because that is completely counterintuitive to what everybody.
Okay,
no,
so
yeah, it's like
so let's
more
go,
than
let's,
2
let's,
times more
let's,
expensive.
let's go one by one.
That piece of marine ply is 91 grams.
Okay, and now the piece of vinyl ester
was 77 grams. And the epoxy was 81. So these are technically lighter.
So this is heavier.
Yes.
By a little bit.
By a tiny bit. Now, I also calculated the weight if we made all the bulkheads out of it. So the vinyl ester, if we made all of our bulkheads, they would have weighed 195 kilos. The epoxy would have been 207 kilos. And the marine ply is 231 kilos.
So it's still a little bit heavier.
But
not by much.
Not by much. So if we made it out of vinyl ester, we would have saved 36 kilos of weight. If we made it out of epoxy, we would have saved 24 kilos in weight.
Which is half my weight.
Which is nothing compared to a 9,000 kilo boat. Saving 30 kilos is silly, especially when it's 7 times more expensive.
Yeah, and especially when the strength isn't really, the comparison isn't that big. So I feel like the marine ply is more comparable to the epoxy version.
The difference is the marine ply didn't bend a whole lot and then just snapped, whereas the epoxy just bent and bent and bent and bent and bent and then eventually broke. I'm not an engineer, so I don't really know how to even calculate deflection before destruction. I'm sure there's a word for that.
But as a bulkhead, I don't think that matters, right? Because the load is
well, you do
spread
want
all
some
around.
twist and flexibility in a boat, right? But this is why if you're designing a new boat, you get an engineer to actually make the calculations for how much composite, and then they design you a layup schedule where you need this much glass here, you need that thick of a bulkhead there. What we're doing is taking this out of the boat that wasn't glassed in the hull and putting this back in when it is glassed in the hull. So we're not really messing around too much with anything new. Otherwise, we would need some engineering and some math and figuring out exactly what to do.
I do have another question there, because on our boat, you have the bulkheads, but then between the bulkheads and the hull, there is foam and there is vinyl ester.
Yeah.
On all the edges. So it's not like if something's gonna crack, there is also vinyl ester strength all around.
The reality is the weakest part about plywood is the glue holding all these layers together. And as we've seen from our vinyl ester versus epoxy video we made before, it delaminates in that first layer of plywood before the glass breaks, whether you're using vinyl ester or epoxy. Mm-hmm. The difference is with these, when you do eventually crack them, they also delaminate on that first layer because the weakest bond is between the glass and the foam. It kind of just tears the foam off. But they're all way stronger than we need to. We could probably build the whole boat out of single layer vinyl ester, and then we would have saved 100 kilos, which is still kind of silly.
But that's
considering it would still be 4 times more money than just plywood, right?
But for how fast it broke with just one layer of vinyl ester,
exactly.
13 kilograms, that was it.
Kind of creepy. If we were making a high performance catamaran or a high performance monohull with a vacuum infused foam core hull, and it was much bigger where the bulkheads did need to be 20 mil or 25 mil, then we'd probably most likely be using foam because you would save the weight. And if we had the facility and a big flat area where we could vacuum bag bulkheads on a big flat glass tabletop like a shipyard, then we'd be doing that as well.
And it would have been stronger. Like this is the comparison
apparently
of just
it's the
laying
same.
glass.
Apparently, it's the same strength.
No. But I'm saying like if we were doing it for a new boat, like vacuum infused, it would have been stronger.
That's the other main difference too. Like these are all hand laid with like a roller, which is sort of like shipyard, like boatyard outdoor quality.
DIY quality.
DIY quality. And the difference is if you're vacuum bagging, you get a little bit more air bubbles out, but you don't actually save any weight because they're still using the same amount of resin and the same amount of glass. So it's more of like a guarantee of quality, so you'll get more consistency out of all of it. Whereas if you're vacuum infusing, you'll save like between 20 and 30% in the resin weight. So the part will be a little bit lighter, but the glass is the same, the foam is the same, you're just saving 20% in the resin weight. So like for this piece, for instance, I did the calculation on all of them. This is 1,200 grams of glass on each side with foam core and resin, right? So if you take this sample and calculate it up to a gram per square meter, we're just over 5 kilos. 822 grams of that is foam. 2,400 grams of that, because there's 2 layers of 600 on each side, is glass, which means the resin is just under 2 kilos of resin if you took this thickness and expanded it all the way to 1 square meter. That 2 kilos of resin, if we vacuum infused it, we'd save, let's say 25%. So you'd save 500 grams, half a kilo, which over the course of a whole boat is a lot. But over the course of 38 square meters of bulkhead, it's hardly anything. We'd save 50 kilos over the whole boat or something like that if we vacuum infused every single bulkhead, and that would take forever.
And for a boat like ours, where she's not a race boat, she doesn't need to be lighter in order to go faster. I don't think it would matter.
We're actually more concerned with our boat being too light than we are with it being too heavy.
Awesome.
Because if it's too light, it's gonna be very uncomfortable and very unstable. And if it's too heavy, it's just going to be a little bit slower but more comfortable. So because we can't get up on a plane and get out of the water anyway, weight affects our boat significantly less than it would on a high performance boat. And since our boat's only 36 feet, the forces involved are completely negligible because this is overkill and this is crazy overkill. We had 2 bulkheads that were sort of kind of glassed into our boat, and now we've got ribs, a new hull, stringers, and bulkheads. They're all glassed into the boat. So it's way stronger than it was before. And our prediction is that we're actually going to be the same weight or slightly lighter when we go back in the water. But yeah, I found that to be crazy that this is 3 times more money than this of similar strength and close enough to being similar weight.
Well, not this.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Rolling the wrong
vinyl
one.
ester. And I also found it crazy that the vinyl ester was stiffer, stronger, lighter, cheaper than the epoxy was. And that's just with West Systems. There's 1,000 different flavors of epoxy out there, so results will vary. That's the problem with all of this, is that the results vary so much with your local material that it's almost impossible to do like an actual scientific test against all of the different types of epoxy, all of the different types of glass, all the different types of foam. But this is what we have available, and these are the prices we have available. And if we were in a different place, building a different boat with different access to materials,
our choices would have been different.
All of our choices would be different.
Yeah.
And we weren't like laminating underneath a borrowed catamaran. That catamaran launched. We don't have a workshop outside anymore.
Good thing we built the Dodger when we did.
Good thing we did.